Hey, what's up guys? I'm Jake Bilt. Thanks for checking out this video. This is the first in a series I'm going to call Facts or Frequently Asked Questions. I put together a list of questions I'm asked all the time from either apprentices in our shop or other technicians when they're running into problems fixing vehicles in their bays. So hopefully these help you. This video is called Too Many Trouble Codes. I'm sure most of you have gotten a check engine light diagnostic, and when you've gone and run a full code scan, you've seen more codes than you can list. There's many codes in all the modules and you don't even know where to start. Let me give you a few pointers on how I organize those codes, how I prioritize those codes, and try and kind of clear your mind so that you can come up with a good game plan on how to diagnose these problems. So every time you're performing testing and analysis, you should have a game plan when you start. Sometimes that plan is going to change as you collect data. When you perform a code scan and you get a long list of codes, I suggest you stop, follow these instructions, and come up with a clear game plan on how you're going to diagnose this vehicle. So first I'm going to share with you just a quick case study. This is a vehicle that I actually looked at today. It's not one with a ton of trouble codes, but I think it'll illustrate some of the examples I want to share with you fairly well. So I have a 2007 Toyota Tundra. The vehicle came in with a complaint of the check engine light on, and the customer said that it idled rough and what sounded like a misfire. And we have 3 different codes stored. So where do we start? The first thing I like to do is get organized. When you have a long list of codes, it can be pretty easy to get scattered and jumping back and forth between all of them. So let's start by trying to organize this list. So I like to look at a long list of codes, kind of like the garage cleanup day. I start by putting all the things that belong together into a pile. So trouble codes are really no different. A lot of times one fault can cause several different trouble codes. So let's organize the codes that we believe may be caused by the same fault or are likely to be. Let's put those into the same category and let's keep them written down together. So sometimes when you see that long list, it can be pretty overwhelming. So try to write that list down. This will help you for a few reasons. You can now leave out duplicate codes because a lot of times you're going to find that you have a listing for a current code, a history code, and a pending code, all of which are the same code number and same description. So you've got 3 on there, making that list seem longer and bigger than it really is. If you'll write these codes down, you can limit that to just 1. Also, as we just talked about prioritizing them or categorizing them together with like faults, you can put these into a category or into a format that makes sense to you. So let's take a look at that case study. Do you think all of those codes that we have stored could be caused by the same fault? Most of you are probably saying yes. A misfire would cause a random cylinder misfire. It could cause the specific ID'd cylinder's misfire, and it could cause an idle malfunction code. So we don't need to panic too much yet that we have 3 separate codes. We can really just clarify that we have one problem. Most likely, we have a misfire. And it's possible that we have something else causing the idle fault, and there might be multiple causes of the misfires. Maybe that's why we have a random cylinder misfire and a specific cylinder misfire. We don't know yet, but we do know that it's highly likely that one problem is causing all of these. So let's try and zone in on that one fault. Now we need to prioritize these fault codes. There's a lot of different ways you can do that. Here's a few examples of how I prioritize which codes I'm going to look into first. What was the customer's concern? Right? If their concern is just that the check engine light is on, that doesn't really help us as far as prioritizing these codes just yet. But if their concern, like in the example I just shared, is that the engine is running rough, we want to focus in on any codes that might cause the engine to run rough. Let's say we have a long list of codes, and one of them might be an evap system fault that we don't believe could contribute to a rough running engine. We're probably going to move that down on our priority list. If we have a code, as in this case, that indicates a misfire, we're going to move that up on our priority list because we're trying to solve the customer's concern first. Next, I always joke that we need to look at these cars like a triage. So the medical definition of triage is the assignment of degree of urgency to wounds or illnesses to decide the order of treatment of a large number of patients or casualties. So no different. We have a large number of patients or casualties, in this case, trouble codes. we need to prioritize which ones are most urgent. So if you were to go into the ER and have a large head wound that's bleeding everywhere, and you tell them that you have a headache, they're probably not going to worry about the headache just yet. They're going to worry about getting that bleeding stopped, getting you bandaged up, getting you stitches or whatever it needs to address that wound. Then we'll look into the headache. So our list of codes is no different. We need to prioritize the most pressing issues, the ones that are going to cause catalyst damage, other immediate damage to different components in our system that are going to cause poor runnability. So in the example of our case study, we have 2 misfire codes and we have an idling code. Well, maybe we shouldn't worry about the idling just yet until we have the engine running well. Even if that code's not related to the misfires, we have to have a smooth running engine before we can analyze or diagnose a fault with the engine idling. Another thing that's beneficial to look into when prioritizing codes is if the code is current or history. If you have that long list of codes again, and a few of them say current, while several of them say history, it doesn't mean you should rule out the history codes, but those current codes are going to be easier to diagnose first and foremost because they're active right now. And as most of you know, actively occurring faults are much easier to diagnose than intermittent faults or faults that might not be occurring in the bay. So let's focus on the faults that we think we can find easier and that are acting up for us right now. Next, I like to look at generic versus manufacturer-specific codes. When you go into the manufacturer-specific side of your scan tool, if you're using an aftermarket scan tool like most of us are, you're going to get a lot more information and you're going to get more codes as well. And that's great for your diagnostic process and strategies and to give you more information as far as what the faults are, but it makes it difficult when you already have a long list. So one thing that will help you kind of prioritize your list is go back out into the global OBD2 section and look and see what codes are on the OBD2 only. One thing you'll find with manufacturer-specific codes is that they often will have multiple codes for the same problem to indicate different situations that it might occur in, or subcode numbers that you'll find. So let's look at the main OBD codes as well, and that will help us shorten and prioritize our list to start attacking this like a triage. The last thing I like to look at is look at the set criteria or the setting conditions, and many times it will list if this code will or will not turn on a check engine light. So if the customer's concern is a check engine light, and specifically if they don't have any runnability issues or complaints of runnability issues, then we probably don't want to prioritize codes that specifically say they won't turn on a check engine light. We want to prioritize the ones that will. You know, one example I would use of that is if you've worked on many Nissans, anytime you check for codes, you find fault code and a knock sensor circuit code. You know, at least for me, it seems like every Nissan I look at has a knock sensor circuit code. And a lot of times if you look at the specific code definition, it will tell you that it does not turn on a check engine light for that specific code. So if the customer's concern is a check engine light, we probably shouldn't make that code a priority. Let's look at the other fault code and get that repaired first. Another step that a lot of technicians take when they have a laundry list of codes is just to perform an all systems code clear. They want to start fresh and see where we're at. And sometimes this is the right way to go about things, but let's talk about it a little more. Generally speaking, you should only clear fault codes once you have diagnosed and repaired the fault. Now, there are certain faults that it will help you to diagnose them when you clear them. You know, one really good example I have is when you're diagnosing airbag system faults and you have circuit codes. Well, a lot of times you can install a known good resistance or an emulator in place of the airbag, clear the faults and see if it comes back. That circuit code generally sets immediately. If you've installed a known good or an emulator of some sort and you clear the codes and it doesn't come back, you know that the airbag was the fault. But that's not always the case and always the best method. Generally, the only time I recommend this with the laundry list type codes is if you have a lot of codes relating to something like a low voltage condition and you know that the customer's replaced the battery or the shop you're at's replaced the battery, you've replaced it, or you know that the vehicle had to be jump started or something like that, that tells you most likely that caused many of these low voltage codes. Let's clear what we know has been repaired. And again, I said you shouldn't do this unless something's been repaired. Well, if the battery's been replaced, that was the repair. If it was jump started and, because the lights were left on or something and charging system and everything tests out fine, well, again, that is the repair. So if you've repaired something that's causing this low voltage condition, let's clear out the codes and see if anything resets. All right, so before we finish this thing, I want to fill you in on the Toyota case study. So for that example, I determined that the most likely fault I had was a single misfire causing all of my faults. So being that this is a coil on plug ignition system and that all of the ignition coils are fairly easy to see and touch, I decided to use a cop paddle with a lab scope to place on top of each ignition coil and monitor a secondary ignition waveform. When I did that, I found that the number 2 ignition coil had a shorted secondary winding, causing no spark. So I replaced the ignition coil, cleared the codes, and I test drove the vehicle. When I first took off on the test drive, I could feel that the idle was extremely low. I also noticed on my inspection that a battery had been messed with, the terminals had been cleaned and whatnot. I asked the service advisor and he said, oh yeah, the customer said when the check engine light first came on, he decided to disconnect the battery to see if he could fix it that way. For those of you that are familiar with Toyotas, you know that if you disconnect the battery, there is an idle relearn that needs to take place. So I took the vehicle on a test drive. I had no check engine light come back. It ran smoothly. The idle came back to where it should be, and I feel the vehicle is fixed. So hopefully this helps you next time you get a long list of codes. I know my case study here only had 3 codes, but I thought it was good to show you how one fault, a bad ignition coil, set 3 different fault codes. And it's possible for that one to set even more. We could have had ignition coil circuit codes and whatnot, all sorts of different things. So the example here is just to show that one simple fault, a bad ignition coil, set 3 different codes. You can see how that would spiral out of control. If we're setting 3 or 4 codes for every fault, and a customer drives their vehicle with several faults, when they come to you, you can have 5, 6, 10 different fault codes, and you need to learn how to prioritize those and in what order you should start diagnosing them and treating these codes to try and fix the vehicle as quickly as you can or diagnose it as quickly as you can. Hopefully this helps you next time you have a vehicle in your bay with a laundry list of trouble codes. Thanks for watching.